Welcome back to the Samvaad podcast series, Decoding the Scriptures. Today we're diving deep into the world of Dhrupad, and we've got a fascinating guide, the 1988 Dhrupad Annual.
It's amazing how relevant this volume still is, even decades later.
Right. It's packed with insights, and for this episode we're starting with, well, a legend.
The legendary Tansen.
You know it. Most people think of him as, like, the star musician of Akbar's court.
Yeah, but the Dhrupad Annual takes us in a totally unexpected direction. Tansen's portraits.
Portraits?
His actual appearance, it turns out, is a bit of a mystery.
Really? What makes scholars question the portraits?
Well, there's a few things. You've got misidentified portraits floating around, causing confusion.
Right, yeah.
And then there's the fact that artistic styles have changed so much over the centuries. A portrait from, say, the 16th century might depict Tansen very differently from one made in the 19th century, even if they're both supposed to be him.
So how do we know which portraits are actually accurate?
That's where this Dhrupad Annual comes in. It highlights an authenticated portrait from Akbar's own time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it gives us specific details, like his attire, even offers a glimpse into his emotional state while performing.
Okay, now we're talking. What kind of emotional state?
Well, the article describes the portrait as capturing Tansen in this moment of deep absorption, with intense emotional expression. Like the artist was trying to convey not just what he looked like, but, the depth of feeling he poured into his music.
That's pretty incredible. It's almost like getting a glimpse into his soul as a musician.
Exactly.
But, going through the source material, I noticed something odd. The Dhrupad Annual points out that Tansen is actually missing from many court paintings that show musical scenes. Why would that be?
That's a great question, and one the article really digs into. It suggests that Tansen's role in Akbar's court might have been more, nuanced than we usually assume.
How so?
Well, maybe he mainly performed for the emperor's inner circle.
Oh, interesting.
Making him less likely to appear in those grand musical gatherings.
That's a fascinating theory. It challenges the whole image of Tansen as, like, this public figure entertaining huge crowds.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if this more exclusive role shaped his musical style.
Absolutely. And maybe even his legacy.
Just from that one detail about his absence in certain paintings, it opens up a whole new way of thinking about him.
Exactly.
This is why I love these deep dives. You never know what tiny detail will lead you down a completely unexpected path.
Couldn't agree more.
And speaking of discoveries, let's move from the visual side of Dhrupad to the evolution of the music itself. This next part is like a linguistic puzzle, so get ready.
Sounds intriguing.
Okay, so we've been talking about Tansen. But now let's zoom in on the music itself, Dhrupad.
Yeah.
And the Dhrupad Annual gets into how the language we use to talk about this music has actually changed over time.
Interesting.
And there's one term that really stood out to me, shtal.
Shtal. That's a perfect example of how our understanding of a Dhrupad has evolved.
Oh.
See, nowadays shtal is practically synonymous with Dhrupad.
Yeah.
But the article points out that this term, it was completely absent from musical texts before the 18th century.
Wait, so a term that's fundamental to Dhrupad today didn't even exist in earlier centuries?
Right.
That's wild.
It really is. It's like, imagine if a word we use every day just poof, appeared out of nowhere a few hundred years ago.
Exactly. So what's the theory? Where did shtal come from?
Well, the Dhrupad Annual goes on this fascinating quest to trace its origins.
Okay.
The authors, they dug deep into ancient musical texts, looking for clues.
Yeah.
And they found some intriguing possibilities in terms like a thatala or a dodicala, which pop up in those earlier texts. Yeah. The article even quotes a 16th century text describing a thada as a rhythmic cycle with, specific characteristics.
So are they saying Athala is like the ancestor of shtal?
That's the idea they're putting forward.
So over time, the name changed. Maybe some nuances of the rhythm shifted.
Possibly.
And it eventually became known as shtal.
Exactly. It's like this linguistic puzzle.
Yeah.
Tracing the evolution of words to understand how musical concepts evolved.
And it really highlights that Dhrupad wasn't, this fixed tradition passed down unchanged for centuries.
Right.
It was constantly changing.
Absolutely. A living, breathing art form.
With its language evolving alongside it.
Precisely. And this brings us to another fascinating point the Dhrupad Annual makes. The inconsistencies in how Dhrupad itself has been defined throughout history.
Oh.
You see, there wasn't always this, like, one universally agreed upon definition.
So different scholars or musicians might have had their own takes on what exactly made something Dhrupad.
Exactly.
What kind of differences are we talking about?
Well, for example, how they described the essential elements of the music, like the language used in the songs, the structure of the different sections within a performance, even the rasa, the emotional expression, were all perceived and explained differently over time.
It's like Dhrupad was this fluid concept, constantly being molded and reshaped by the musicians and scholars who were engaging with it.
Exactly. It reminds us that even with ancient traditions, there's always room for interpretation.
Absolutely. This deep dive is really making me rethink any assumptions I had about Dhrupad being this static, unchanging form.
I know, right?
It clearly had this like dynamic energy constantly adapting and evolving.
And speaking of dynamic energy, let's talk about a captivating figure whose story is also featured in the Dhrupad Annual, Pete Veni Madhav Lande, often referred to as Hayaji.
Ah, Payaji. His dedication to Dhrupad is so inspiring. The way the Dhrupad Annual tells his story, it's with such reverence.
It's a story that shows not just the beauty of the music, but also the sacrifices that artists often make for their art.
From what I remember, Bayaji went to extraordinary lengths to learn Dhrupad.
He did. As a young man, he was driven by this unyielding desire to master this art form, so he embarked on this musical pilgrimage to Calcutta, which was, the cultural hub where he believed he'd find the best teachers.
Right. And this wasn't just a casual trip, was it? I remember reading something about him having to make tough choices to fund this journey.
You're absolutely right. The Dhrupad Annual mentions how Bayaji, in his dedication, actually resorted to selling household items to support his musical aspirations.
Wow.
It wasn't just about learning music. It was a testament to his deep commitment to this musical heritage.
It's amazing to think about those sacrifices.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the power of Dhrupad and how deeply these musicians connected with this tradition. So after all that, after going to such lengths to get to Calcutta, did Bayaji become this renowned performer? Did he teach, share his knowledge widely?
That's where the story takes a kind of bittersweet turn.
Oh.
Even with all his talent and the devoted students he had, Bayaji's legacy, it kind of faded after he passed away. The Dhrupad Annual, it actually laments that only fragments of his teachings and style remain, passed down through a few of his disciples.
That's sad.
It is.
It makes you wonder why someone so dedicated, so talented, wouldn't achieve wider recognition.
I think it's a reminder that not every master becomes famous in their lifetime. Sometimes their contributions are more, subtle, woven into the tradition through their students, rather than through public acclaim.
Like a hidden lineage.
Exactly.
A branch of the Dhrupad tree that wasn't fully documented or celebrated.
Precisely. And that's what makes the work of this Dhrupad Annual so important.
Right.
By shining a light on figures like Bayaji, it helps bring those forgotten stories back to life.
Absolutely. So who are some of these students who carried on his legacy?
Well, the article mentions a few, including Plate Ramchandra Bhuvabhav and Srihari Sapra. And while their stories are, fragmented, they offer us a glimpse into this rich tapestry of talent that flourished under Bayaji's guidance.
It speaks to the power of that Guru Shishya Parampara, that tradition of passing knowledge from teacher to student.
Yeah.
Even if the guru's name isn't widely remembered, the essence of their teachings lives on through their students.
Beautifully put.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Dhrupad, I'm just struck by how much we can learn from a single source like this, Dhrupad Annual. It's given us insights into Tansen's life, the evolution of the musical terminology, and that touching story of Bayaji and his disciples.
It really has been a fascinating journey.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface,
Definitely.
And that's the beauty of the Samvaad podcast series, Decoding the Scriptures. We're peeling back the layers, delving into these ancient scriptures to uncover those hidden gems. So, for those listening, as you continue exploring Dhrupad, I want to leave you with a question. How might understanding the historical context of musical forms, the evolution of terms, the stories of the masters, how might that deepen our appreciation for the music itself?
That's a wonderful question to ponder.
It really is.
When we grasp that historical tapestry woven into each note, each rhythm, each phrase, I think the music transforms into something even more profound, more meaningful.
It's like we're not just hearing sounds, we're connecting with a legacy, a living tradition that's resonated for centuries.
Absolutely.
And that, my friends, is the power of the Samvaad podcast series, Decoding the Scriptures.
It is.
Join us next time as we delve into another fascinating chapter of musical history.